In the summer of 1944, on a jungle trail somewhere between Burma and India, a Japanese soldier sat down against a tree and did not get up. He was not shot. He was not wounded. He simply stopped. Around him, hundreds of other men were doing the same thing, sitting, lying, dying in the mud, while the monsoon rain came down so hard it turned the trails into rivers. These men had marched over mountains carrying rifles and 3 weeks of rice. The rice was gone. The objectives they had been sent to capture were still in British hands, and the general who had sent them here was sitting in a headquarters 60 miles away, refusing to give the order to retreat. His name was Renya Mutaguchi, and the most important thing you need to understand about him is this. By any measure available to him at the time, he had every reason to believe he was right. Go back 7 years. July 7, 1937. A Japanese regiment is on night exercises near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Peking. A single soldier, Private Shimura Kikujiro, slips away from his unit in the dark to find a place to relieve himself. He gets lost. He is gone for less than an hour. When shots are fired from somewhere in the confusion, both sides raise their weapons. A skirmish breaks out. By morning, both sides are mobilizing. The commanding officer of that regiment is Lieutenant Colonel Renya Mutaguchi. He did not plan this. He did not fire the first shot. But when negotiations stalled and his superiors in Tokyo sent word to de-escalate, Mutaguchi pushed forward anyway. He smelled opportunity. Within 72 hours, what could have been a minor incident had become a full military engagement. Within weeks, Japan and China were at war. Within months, 1 million soldiers were fighting from Shanghai to Peking. Mutaguchi received a commendation. That moment lodged itself into him like a splinter. He had acted on instinct, ignored caution, pushed past the point where every reasonable person said stop. And it had worked. The war he had helped ignite made careers for dozens of officers. It made his. He rose steadily through the ranks, fought in China, built a reputation as a commander who moved fast and thought big. By March 1943, he was a full general, given command of the Japanese 15th Army in Burma. And by late 1943, he had a plan that his superiors, his subordinates, and his own staff were unanimously telling him was going to fail. The plan was called Operation Yugo. The idea was to cross the Arakan mountain range from Burma into northeast India, destroy the main British supply base at Imphal, cut the supply lines feeding the Chinese war effort, and, in Mutaguchi's private version of events which he shared openly with his staff, trigger a nationalist uprising that would push Britain out of Asia entirely. He told at least one officer that he intended to ride a white horse through the streets of Delhi. The staff officers who heard this said nothing to his face. In private, they were appalled. The central problem was simple. The Arakan Mountains are not gentle hills. They are dense jungle ridges rising nearly 3,000 meters, threaded with rivers that flood in monsoon season, with almost no roads and no infrastructure capable of supporting a modern army. Moving 3 full divisions across that terrain was already an enormous challenge. Moving them with enough food and ammunition to fight a major battle on the other side was something that serious military planners considered functionally impossible. Mutaguchi's solution was to need less food. He told his divisional commanders the operation would last 15 days. His men would carry 3 weeks of rations. They would cross the mountains, overrun the British positions before the defenders could react, and feed themselves from captured enemy supply depots. The logistics problem, in his view, was not a logistics problem, it was a commitment problem. Men who believed in victory did not need supply lines. In a conference room at 15th Army headquarters in late 1943, Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, commander of the 31st Division, a man who had spent years in jungle combat and knew precisely what his soldiers could and could not do, stood up and told Mutaguchi directly that the plan would destroy the army. Mutaguchi looked at him and said he was a coward. Sato sat down. Lieutenant General Genzo Yanagida of the 33rd Division submitted a formal written objection. Mutaguchi had it filed and ignored. Lieutenant General Masafumi Yamauchi of the 15th Division, who was already suffering from tuberculosis and knew his men were under strength, raised the same concerns. He was told to focus on training. Every officer above Mutaguchi who reviewed the plan, the Burma Area Army Chief of Staff, the Vice Chief of the Southern Expeditionary Army Group, a special envoy sent directly from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, came away with the same conclusion. The supply situation had no solution, and the offensive would collapse before it reached its objectives. Mutaguchi met each objection with the same response. He had heard this before. He had heard it in China when people said the army couldn't advance without secure supply lines, and the army had advanced anyway and won. The men raising these objections had never done what he had done. They were calculating from manuals. He was calculating from experience. There was one more thing pushing him, something that no staff officer would put in writing. In early 1943, a British general named Orde Wingate had marched 3,000 soldiers deep into Japanese-held Burma, in what became known as the Chindit Operation. Wingate's men caused limited military damage, but the British announced it to the world. Newspapers ran the story. Japanese troops, the soldiers who had conquered Malaya, Singapore, and Burma in months, had been walked through, outmaneuvered, and embarrassed on their own ground. In their own jungle. Mutaguchi read those reports and felt something he had never felt before in his career. He felt humiliated. He needed to answer it. Not as a strategic response, but personally. He needed to do something so large, so decisive that the Chindits would be a footnote. He needed Delhi. He needed the White Horse. He needed the war in Asia to end with his name on it. By December 1943, the objectors had been worn down or transferred. Prime Minister Tojo gave his approval for the operation during a meeting so brief that one staff officer later recalled the entire discussion took less time than it takes to eat breakfast. Burma Area Army Commander Lieutenant General Kawabe had reservations but not enough spine to override the general who had already made up his mind months before the first briefing. Operation Yugo was authorized. Start date, March 8, 1944. On the night of March 7th, Mutaguchi stood before his assembled commanders and gave a speech. He told them they stood at the hinge of history. He told them that the road to Delhi was open and that spirit would overcome any obstacle that logistics could not solve. Some of his commanders listened with expressions of belief. Most listened with expressions that, under military discipline, looked like belief. Then they walked out into the dark and gave their orders. 85,000 Japanese soldiers moved into the mountains. Some units had been issued cattle to drive alongside them as a mobile food source, Mutaguchi's personal solution to the supply problem his staff had been raising for months. The cattle were nearly useless on jungle mountain trails. Most of them died before the divisions reached their start lines. The men ate what they could and kept moving. Nobody told Mutaguchi about the cattle. Nobody told him a lot of things anymore. Because the last man who had told Renya Mutaguchi something he did not want to hear had been called a coward in front of his peers, and then watched his written objection disappear into a filing cabinet. And so 85,000 men walked into the mountains on a 15-day supply plan toward an enemy that already knew they were coming. On March 14, 1944, 6 days after the Japanese crossed into India, a British signals officer at Imphal picked up his telephone and reported something that made no sense. The Japanese were already behind him, not approaching, not 2 days away. Behind him, right now, on the road he had driven that morning. 3 full Japanese divisions had crossed the Arakan Mountains faster than anyone predicted, cut the main road north of Imphal, and were wrapping around the entire British position in the valley. By every rule of conventional warfare, this was the moment to order a fighting withdrawal before the encirclement closed completely. 80,000 British and Indian soldiers were about to be surrounded in a jungle valley with one airstrip, whatever supplies happened to be stacked in the depots and no ground route out. The British commander who received that report was General William Slim. He read it. He set it down. He did not order a withdrawal. He picked up his phone and told his supply officers to accelerate the stockpiling inside the perimeter. He had been waiting for exactly this moment for 4 months. Slim is the figure in this story that history has never quite known what to do with. He was not photogenic. He was not quotable in the way that Patton or Montgomery were quotable. He was a large, plain-faced man from Birmingham who had been wounded in Gallipoli in the First War, had fought in Iraq and East Africa and Syria before Burma, and who had personally commanded the brutal British retreat down the length of Burma in 1942, a retreat so catastrophic that it remains the longest in British military history. He had walked out of Burma with his army largely intact, but with the knowledge of exactly why they had lost burned permanently into him. They had lost because they ran. Every time the Japanese cut a road behind them, British units panicked, abandoned their supplies, and retreated. The Japanese captured the depots, fed themselves from British rations, and pushed forward again. The pattern repeated itself the entire length of Burma. The Japanese did not defeat the British with superior firepower. They defeated them by making them afraid of encirclement, and the British had done the rest themselves. Slim spent the next 2 years building an army that would not do that. He visited units personally, not inspections, not speeches. He sat with platoon commanders in jungle clearings and asked them what they were most afraid of. The answer, almost universally, was the same: being cut off, surrounded, left behind. Slim listened to this in camp after camp, and then he told them in plain language what he was going to ask them to do. He was going to let the Japanese surround them, on purpose. And when that happened, they were going to stay exactly where they were, hold their positions, hold their supplies, and let the RAF feed them from the air until the Japanese starved. Some of them thought he was out of his mind. He told them to think about the mathematics instead. A Japanese soldier crossing the Arakan Mountains on a 15-day rice supply cannot sustain offensive operations for more than 3 weeks. A British soldier inside a fortified position with an air supply depot can sustain defensive operations indefinitely. The Japanese need to capture British supplies to survive. If the British refuse to abandon their supplies, the Japanese die. It is not complicated. It is arithmetic. He said it so many times in so many places that by March 1944, his soldiers did not just understand it intellectually. They believed it in the way that soldiers need to believe something when the shells are landing and every instinct they have is telling them to run. When the Japanese crossed the mountains, Slim's men held. And nowhere did they hold in a way more difficult, more savage, or more impossible to believe than at a place called Kohima. Kohima was a small administrative town on a mountain ridge in Nagaland about 70 miles north of Imphal. It sat astride the main road to Dimapur, which was the railhead supplying the entire Imphal valley. If the Japanese captured Dimapur, the siege of Imphal became mathematically unsolvable. Mutaguchi knew this. He sent his entire 31st Division, 60,000 men under Lieutenant General Sato, to take Kohima and then push straight through to the railhead. The garrison at Kohima when Sato's lead elements arrived on April 5th numbered approximately 1,500 men. Not 15,000, 1,500. They were clerks, cooks, soldiers recovering from illness, a mule transport company, and one understrength infantry battalion that had arrived almost by accident 48 hours before the Japanese. Sato had been told to take Kohima in 4 days. What he found when he got there was that 1,500 men given enough ammunition and no option to retreat are very difficult to kill quickly. The battle that followed compressed itself into a space so small it becomes almost impossible to visualize in military terms. The entire Kohima Ridge was less than a kilometer long. As the Japanese pushed the garrison back through the first days of fighting, the perimeter contracted until the defenders were holding a cluster of positions on a single hilltop. At the center of that hilltop was the bungalow of the Deputy Commissioner of Kohima, a colonial official named Charles Pawsey, who had lived there in peacetime surrounded by a garden and a grass tennis court. For 2 weeks in April 1944, British and Japanese soldiers fought each other across that tennis court. Not as a metaphor, literally across it. The Japanese held one side of the court, the British held the other. The distance between the forward trenches at the closest point was the width of the baseline, less than 12 meters. Men threw grenades back and forth across the net post. Snipers fired from the bungalow's veranda into foxholes on the far side of the lawn. At night, soldiers on both sides could hear the other side breathing. During the day, the wounded had to lie where they fell because the perimeter was too small and too exposed to move them anywhere. The garrison had no running water. They collected rain in whatever containers they could find and rationed it to 1 cup per man per day. They held for 13 days before relief arrived. 13 days, 1,500 men against a full Japanese division. When the relief column finally fought its way up the road and made contact with the garrison, the British officer leading it walked into what had been Pawsey's garden and stopped. He said later that he could not find a single square meter of ground that did not contain either a shell crater, a body, or both. The Japanese paid an enormous price for those 13 days. Every day Sato spent at Kohima was a day his men burned through rations they could not replace. Every assault on the garrison's perimeter cost soldiers Mutaguchi could not reinforce. By the time the British relief column arrived and Sato was forced to pull back from the town itself, his division was already bleeding out, not from bullets but from hunger, malaria, and dysentery. He sent Mutaguchi a message requesting permission to withdraw and consolidate. Mutaguchi told him to hold and attack. Sato sent back a reply that still sits in the Japanese military archives. He wrote that he had fulfilled his duty to the limit of human capability. He wrote that his division had no food and no ammunition. He wrote that he considered Mutaguchi's order to continue attacking to be evidence of a commander who had lost contact with reality. And then he wrote the line that no subordinate general in the Imperial Japanese Army had ever put in writing to a superior. He wrote that Mutaguchi was the most foolish commander in the history of the Japanese Army. Then he ordered the withdrawal himself. At Imphal, the pattern was the same. General Yanagida of the 33rd Division reported unsustainable casualties attacking prepared positions and requested permission to consolidate. Mutaguchi relieved him on April 19th. General Yamauchi of the 15th Division, by now seriously ill, reported his division was exhausted and could not continue offensive operations. Mutaguchi relieved him on May 20th. He replaced both men with more aggressive officers. The new commanders attacked. They achieved nothing. They lost more men. At Slim's headquarters, the intelligence reports coming in told a story so consistent it was almost clinical. Japanese attacking strength was declining week by week. Air supply to the Imphal garrison was holding. The math that Slim had explained to his soldiers in jungle clearings 2 years ago was playing out exactly as he had calculated. He allowed himself, in a letter to his wife written sometime in May, one sentence about how things were going. He wrote, "I think we have them. What he did not write, because he was that kind of man, was what he already knew from the casualty estimates his intelligence officers were compiling. The Japanese divisions in the hills were not just losing the battle, they were disintegrating. Men were eating grass. Men were eating leather. Men were dying of starvation on mountain trails while their commanding general, 60 miles away, sent orders to attack. The monsoon was 3 weeks away. When it arrived, the trails through the Arakan Mountains, the same trails 85,000 men had marched down in March, would become rivers of mud. The wounded who could not walk would not survive them. The sick, and by now almost every man in every division was sick with something, would struggle to move at all. Mutaguchi had one decision left that could have saved any meaningful portion of his army. He needed to give the order to retreat before the monsoon arrived. He did not give it. The monsoon arrived in mid-June 1944. Within 72 hours, every trail through the Arakan Mountains turned into something that stopped resembling a path. The jungle absorbed the rain and gave it back as mud, knee-deep, then waist-deep in the low sections, that swallowed boots, swallowed wheels, swallowed men who sat down to rest and found they could not stand back up. The temperature dropped, the rivers flooded, and somewhere on those trails the remnants of 3 Japanese divisions that had crossed those same mountains 12 weeks earlier as a conquering army began trying to find their way back. Mutaguchi still had not given the order to retreat. They were not retreating. They were dissolving. Units had stopped functioning as units. Officers had stopped functioning as officers. What remained was tens of thousands of individual men, each making the same private calculation. If I stay here, I die, so I will walk. Most of them would die anyway. But they walked because walking was the only thing left that felt like a choice. Tokyo forced the issue on July 4th. Imperial General Headquarters issued a direct order halting the Imphal offensive. Mutaguchi acknowledged it. The official retreat began. It was too late by weeks. What followed on those mountain trails has no clean military name. Historians call it a retreat. The Japanese soldiers who survived it called it something else. They called it the Road of Bones. To understand what that name means, you need to understand what a man looks like after 12 weeks in the jungle with almost no food. The average Japanese soldier entering Burma in March 1944 weighed around 60 kilograms. By July, survivors arriving at field stations were being documented at 35 to 40 kilograms, the weight of a 12-year-old child. They had eaten everything available in sequence, first their rations, then foraged jungle plants, then grass, then leather stripped from their own boots and belts. Some men were found dead with their hands still closed around leaves they had been trying to eat when they lost consciousness. They were moving through terrain that punished every physical weakness without mercy. The mountain trails rose and dropped hundreds of meters over distances of a few kilometers. In monsoon conditions, a healthy soldier with a full pack moved at 2 kilometers per hour on a good trail. These men were not healthy. Most had malaria, most had dysentery. Many had both simultaneously, along with jungle ulcers that had eaten through skin to the bone beneath. A soldier with advanced dysentery loses all control of his body. He cannot stop. He cannot choose. On the march, men walked in their own filth because stopping meant falling behind, and falling behind in those mountains meant dying alone in the mud. The trail announced itself by what had been left on it. Equipment first, rifles, helmets, ammunition boxes, shed because men were too weak to carry anything that did not keep them alive. Then personal belongings, photographs, letters from home. The small objects soldiers carry because leaving them feels like a betrayal, abandoned finally when even paper became too heavy. Then the men themselves sitting against tree roots or lying face down across the trail, past the point of making decisions. The soldiers who survived described passing hundreds of these men on the way down. Some were already dead. Some were still conscious, tracking the movement of the column with their eyes. A man lying on a trail who could no longer walk would sometimes reach out and touch the leg of a passing soldier, not asking to be carried, not asking for water, just touching someone who was still moving. Nobody stopped. Nobody could afford to stop. At the Chindwin River, British and Indian troops advancing behind the retreat documented what they found on the riverbank in reports that their commanders later described as among the most difficult they had ever read. The bank was covered with men who had reached the water and had nothing left. Some had drowned trying to cross. Some had sat down on the bank and died there within sight of the far side. Officers who had commanded hundreds arrived with 4 or 5 men. Units that had fought at Kohima and Imphal as organized formations arrived as individuals who happened to be moving in the same direction. The river did not care about rank or fighting spirit or the speeches Mutaguchi had given in March. Of the 85,000 men who had crossed into India, roughly 30,000 did not come back. The majority of them did not die from enemy fire. They died on the trail. They died at the river. They died of starvation and disease in a retreat that should have begun in May and did not begin until July, because the man who had sent them there could not bring himself to admit that the plan had failed. Mutaguchi was relieved of command on August 30th, 1944. He flew back to Japan and waited for his court-martial. It never came. The Imperial Japanese Army could not afford the public examination. A trial meant testimony. Testimony meant documents. Documents meant the full dimensions of the disaster entering the official record in a country still fighting a war it was losing everywhere. Mutaguchi was quietly retired. He lost his command, he kept his pension, he kept his freedom. He kept, for the rest of his life, his certainty that none of it had been his fault. He gave interviews, he wrote, he explained in detail across 20 years why the responsibility for what happened belonged to everyone but himself. Sato's insubordination at Kohima, Yanagida's lack of offensive spirit, the weather, the British air supply which had worked better than it should have. In a 1955 interview, he said that if his divisional commanders had possessed the fighting determination he had asked of them, Imphal would have fallen. He said this in 1955, 11 years after 30,000 men died on the trail back from Imphal. One of the things that survived the retreat was a diary. It was found on the Chindwin riverbank in late 1944 by a British officer advancing with the relief column. The soldier who kept it was identified only by a regimental number. The last entry was dated July 18, 1944, 2 weeks into the official retreat. The soldier wrote that he had not eaten in 4 days. He wrote that the man who had marched beside him since training in 1942 had sat down on the trail the previous afternoon and would not get up. He wrote that he had sat with him for 1 hour talking and then stood up and continued walking because he could not think of what else to do. There were no more entries after that. Not because the soldier died. Nobody knows what happened to him. But because after that afternoon on the trail, there was apparently nothing left that he wanted to write down. Renya Mutaguchi died in Tokyo on August 3, 1966, at the age of 78. No representative of the families of the 30,000 dead attended his funeral. Nobody had thought to invite them. Or perhaps someone had thought of it and decided against it. The road of bones by then had been completely reclaimed by the jungle. The trails disappeared under 20 years of growth. The equipment rusted into the soil. The rivers smoothed over whatever the mud had not already taken. If you walked those mountains today, you would find nothing, except that the name survived. It moves through the historical record quietly, in footnotes and regimental histories and the memoirs of men who came home and spent the rest of their lives not talking about what they saw on the way down. The Road of Bones, named not by historians, not by generals, named by the men who walked it because they needed a way to describe something that the existing military vocabulary had no word for. A place where an army went to die, not because the enemy killed it, but because one man refused to believe he could be wrong.